Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to my house. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on our YouTube channel. It's been 2 weeks now since the new Congress took charge on Capitol Hill, with Republicans increasing their majority in the House and winning control of the Senate. Many Americans are wondering whether this Congress will get along with itself. In this politically charged climate, will members reach compromises on vital issues that command broad support? When tonight's program is over, we may or may not have the answer, but we'll certainly have better insights into what's really going on up the road on Capitol Hill. Our program tonight centers on a new book, The Partisan Divide, Congress in Crisis, by two of our guests tonight. Both are former members of Congress, and our program is presented in partnership with the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. I want to mention here the special relationship between the Congress and the National Archives. The Archives holds the permanent records of 3 branches of the federal government. This includes more than 500 million pages of congressional and legislative branch materials deposited here in our Center for Legislative Archives. These congressional records document the history of representative government in America since the adoption of the Constitution. They also include materials gathered over the years by committees and subcommittees. These records help researchers, historians, journalists, lawyers, educators, students, and others to more fully appreciate the intent of our elected representatives and to better understand the story of our democracy. Before we get to tonight's program, I'd like to mention 2 other programs coming up in this theater. Next Tuesday, January 27th at 7, we'll present the film The Decade of Discovery, which follows the events that unfolded between 2002 and 2012, when a government attorney sought to find a better way to search White House email. The film's director, Joe Luby, will lead a panel discussion following the showing of the film. And on Tuesday, February 3rd at 7, we'll welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Eric Foner of Columbia University to discuss his new book, Gateway to Freedom: The Hidden History of the Underground Railroad. The book tells the dramatic story of fugitive slaves and those anti-slavery activists who defied the law to help them reach freedom. A panel discussion will be followed by a book signing. If you want to know more about these and all of our programs, please refer to our monthly calendar of events. There are sign-up sheets in the lobby where you can receive it virtually and in the regular mail. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby also. And a little-known secret that I keep telling everyone, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the Foundation for the National Archives. We're pleased to present this program in partnership with the Association of Former Members of Congress, and we thank this distinguished organization for its ongoing support through our partnership. The current president of the association is the Honorable Barbara Kennelly, who served 17 years in the House of Representatives, representing the 1st Congressional District of Connecticut. She's also founder and president of Barbara Kennelly Associates and is a distinguished professor of political science at Trinity Washington University here in the district. Please welcome Barbara Kennelly.
Thank you, but particularly I want to thank our gracious host, Mr. David Ferriero. David has been wonderful to the former members organization, and we've had this partnership, and we're in the 5th year of our partnership of the former members of Congress and the National Archives. Our goal is to bring together panels and engage in bipartisan discussions with Republicans and Democrats together, talking about solutions rather than what separates us. Former members of Congress have put much energy into these programs. As I said, we've been doing it for 5 years, and we've had a crowd as nice as you each time, and I thank you so much for coming with us this evening. So I am very, very delighted to begin to introduce. I'm just going to mention the names of the former members of Congress, but we have a really very wonderful treat tonight, because we not only have former members of Congress, we have sitting members of Congress. And this shows how much we are going to get along in this Congress. We're setting the stage. And so our first person is Dan Glickman. He's an experienced moderator. And Dan is a former member of Congress, and he's also a former Secretary of the Agriculture. And then we're going to have Greg Walden, who is a Republican, and he's from the state of Oregon. Chris Van Hollen, who is a congressman from Maryland. We have Tom Davis, the author of the book. And as you heard, this book is just wonderful. Wait till you read it. And Martin Frost and Tom are going to tell you about it. So we have Chris Van Hollen then, and I said Craig Walden, and we've got these two Republican sitting members, a Democrat-Republican sitting member of Congress, and a Democrat-Republican former member of Congress. And if everybody acts like we're going to act tonight, it's going to be a wonderful 2 years. Thank you, thank you, thank you for coming.
Thanks, Barbara. Okay. Yeah, let's see. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm Dan Glickman, and I am your moderator, but we have four very talented folks in the audience today, and they have been introduced. Greg Walden isn't on your list, and so Greg has served in the Congress since 1998, and he was in the Oregon legislature. Actually, I traveled to China with Greg a long time ago as well. We had a good time there. You've heard from the other people. But what's interesting tonight is you have two extremely talented former members of Congress who are great legislators, served with them, and the country is much better off because of them. Then you got two extremely talented current members of Congress who are well respected within their own parties and across the aisle as well. And all four of these people chaired their congressional campaign committees. So they're well experienced in how to get to Congress, and they're experienced in how to stay in Congress as well. I'm just curious, do we have any other former members of Congress in the audience? Raise your hands. I can't see very well, but I see Earl Pomeroy, I see Bob Clement, I see
Mark Kennedy
from GW. I know him from those days, and there may be more as well. So anyway, Martin and Tom have written this great book called The Partisan Divide, which they will be signing at 9 o'clock. We're going to end by 9 o'clock. We're going to try to talk for about an hour or so, and then 30 minutes worth of Q&A from the audience as well. So it's a great opportunity. And the book is an excellent discussion of the current problems and some solutions to the problems in Congress. And it's extremely relevant for the times that we're in. You know, Congress has always been the butt of jokes. And I found two quotes from Mark Twain, which I thought were representative of perhaps the current feeling about Congress, but they were said and written 117 years ago. And he said, "It could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctively Native American criminal class except Congress." Okay, that wasn't yesterday. That was a long time ago. But then he made it more general, and he said, "All Congresses and parliaments have a kindly feeling for idiots and compassion for them on account of personal experience and heredity." But notwithstanding all of that, there's no question there is an enormous amount of discussion about our political system in America and the feeling that it's not working as well as it could, or working as well as it did. And so I want to first go to Tom, and I'm going to ask Martin the same question. Is this nostalgia, or do you think the system is just not working as well? I wonder how you'd respond to that.
Well, I don't think there's any question it's not working well. I think everybody up here would agree this system doesn't work the way we would like it to, or the way the Founding Fathers probably envisioned it. And Martin and I, maybe out of nostalgia, started taking a look at this. We started doing some appearances together. Martin and I were chairman of our respective campaign committees, but we never competed against each other, which is why we are friends today. I want to also introduce Rich Cohen over here, who's our third author. Rich was the... Rich was the adult in the group. He had written before, and he was a co-editor of the Almanac of American Politics, and added a a lot of substance to this in terms of making sure our charts were right and everything as well, and was a substantive contributor. And thank you, Rich, for helping make this book what it is. But we started taking a look at what had occurred and why things were different than when we first came in, and why things weren't functioning as well. And you come to the conclusion in political science, they call it the ideological sorting of the parties. We used to have conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, and parties mattered, but there was a lot of crossover on voting, and as time evolved, we started seeing the middle disappear. And we said, why is this? And so we started to take a look at what has happened over the last 20 years that has made this happen. I saw it firsthand as chairman of the campaign committee in 2000 and 2002, where I saw the evolution of the parties, and it wasn't going the way I thought it should go. It was not economic alignments. Both parties paid a lot of attention to what I call the cultural issues, people making their party decisions in terms of their party identification based on race, ethnicity, cultural preferences. Economics really became a distant fourth. So we started to say, what has happened? And we found basically, and I'll keep it quick and we can go through in the comment period in more depth, 3 major factors that had occurred over the last 2 decades that had helped cause this. And one by itself wouldn't probably make a difference, but the combination of the 3 made it combustible. First was really the advent of single-party districts. The districts have to be the same in population, but as you look at the House today, probably 80% of these districts we know what party they're going to elect. They're single-party districts. The primary is the only race that matters, and members have now oriented their voting records, their rhetoric, their attention to that narrow ideological band that nominates them. Because November, as we like to say, is nothing more in these districts than a constitutional formality they have to go through to get elected. These races are decided in primaries. There are several causes for this, gerrymander being one, but you have residential sorting patterns in cities where there just aren't any Republicans, and some rural areas where there aren't any Democrats. You have the Voting Rights Act, which has you pack minorities in districts so they can get fair representation, but in packing minorities, we found out you end up bleaching the districts around it. So in the South, in the Deep South, for example, all you have are white Republicans and black Democrats with no need to talk to the other side, because they are not determinative of the electoral outcomes in those districts. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? We don't make a case on that, but the reality is that is part of the divide, and in their voting records and behavior in Congress, they behave accordingly. But 2 other factors come into play. One is the media models that have evolved since the equal time doctrine went away, and that is you now have media outlets, whether it's cable news, talk radio, internet sites, that cater to one ideological group to attract its viewers or listeners or people to its place. And that's their model. We don't consider it serious news, but it's certainly an entertainment model that is a successful business model. And that carries the message in many cases. Greg, I was on the House floor on opening day, and members were being bombarded with calls saying, dump Boehner. They've gotten people either through the electronic media or through Fox or something. And one member said, I got 1,000 calls against Boehner this morning. He said, you'd think he'd have one friend that could have called me and say, vote for him. But it is the power of this new media that is shaping things and moving them apart. And then finally, adding to that is what's happened to campaign finance. In our efforts to try to make the system less corruptible, we've had some unintended consequences, because all McCain-Feingold did is it took money away from the national parties and said this soft money, they couldn't take it, but the money didn't disappear from politics. It's appeared in other ways now out on the wings in 501c4s, super PACs, much of what we call dark money, that is, nobody knows where it comes from. And this is, by moving from the parties, which have been a centering force for 200 years, it is now out on the wings. So these 3, we think, have been combustible. A couple other things have happened. We are now voting more party than we are person. We have a chapter in the book called All Politics is No Longer Local, and we can have a discussion on this with the campaign chairman. I think their experience will bear this out. Earl Pomeroy certainly knows what I'm talking about, that these races have become very nationalized now, where people may like their member, but they're voting straight across in the party. I think, 96% of House Democrats are from districts that Obama carried. You're getting very few districts, very few members that represent outside that. So those are some of the factors that we talk about in the book, and we try to make an explanation for what has happened. We give some suggestions to start a dialogue and how it gets fixed. Martin.
Well, I do want to get at some point to some key things that can be optimistic about the future of how the system runs. But Martin, because I think the problems are pretty shared in terms of knowledge. The question is, what do we do about it to make our democracy more resilient? What are some of the recommendations? But Martin, I will call on you next.
Well, Dan, we made the point in the book that we are basically optimistic people. We believe in our system of government. We believe that things can be better. That doesn't mean it's going to happen automatically, but that we hope that it will. Now, let me comment on a couple of things that Tom said, and then I want to talk about a couple of the remedies. One of the interesting things, and Tom touched on this, when he says they're one-party districts and that the race is in the primary, very few members of Congress lose primaries even today. But many members of Congress change their voting record so to prevent having an opponent in their own party primary. I mean, I come from a very conservative state, Texas, and a lot of Republican congressmen from Texas. Some of these are very fine, principled people and would like to vote in the middle. They would like to be able to support bipartisan solutions, but they live in mortal fear that there's going to be a small turnout of dedicated zealots in their primary, and that if they ever say anything nice about a legislation offered by a Democrat, or if they ever indicate that they might be willing to do something on a bipartisan basis, that they'll have a very serious primary challenge. And so while people aren't defeated in primaries, what's happened is the way the districts are drawn and the fact that you have low turnouts in primaries, that this has caused members to alter their behavior and be less likely to talk to the other side. A classic example of that is a friend of mine, Pat Roberts from Kansas, a very good guy. Pat faced the prospect of a serious Tea Party opponent in this last election in the Republican primary. Pat altered his voting record. He went hard right, didn't vote for anything that could be characterized as being bipartisan. He barely won the primary against a relatively weak candidate, but the Tea Party was strong. And had he not done that, he might well have lost in his own primary. And there are other examples that you could cite too. Tom talked about the role of money in politics. Tom and I both spoke out against McCain-Feingold when it was being considered in Congress. And the reason we came to the same conclusion, that this would significantly weaken the role of political parties, because the money that wealthy individuals could give to political parties, that unions and corporations could give to political parties, would be banned. Now, the interesting thing, I was chairman of the committee pre-McCain-Feingold. We had to disclose every dollar that was given to us. Every corporate dollar, every labor union dollar, every wealthy individual dollar was on the public record. It was required by statute. And when McCain-Feingold passed, it took this money away, this money that had been disclosed, took it away from the parties, and inevitably forced it out to the extremes, much of which is not disclosed. The other thing about gerrymandering, Tom talked about what happened in the South, and obviously there needed to be creation of African-American districts. No one questioned that. There were a number of southern states that had never had African-American members. But what happened was the Republican Party, and I tipped my hat to them, I didn't like what they did, but they very shrewdly, in some southern states, convinced individual leaders in the black community to join forces with them to pack these new districts with as large a number of African Americans as possible. Now, some people in the African American community were willing to do that because they were worried if the district was only 55 or 60% African American, that they might lose to a white in the primary. So they went along, and not everybody did that. John Lewis spoke out against that. But there were some people in the African American community who so desperately wanted to have African American districts that they were willing to see African Americans removed from the surrounding districts where they had been the swing vote. Now, that's only one part of gerrymandering. Outside of the South, you've had very partisan gerrymandering. This has been done by both parties, but it was particularly done in recent years when Republicans took control of state legislatures in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and we have a page in the book that shows that in those three states in the last presidential election, Democrats carried, not by a large margin, but carried the vote in those three states for president and for Congress. And yet, the districts were drawn in such a way that the
You mean there were
Congressional
more votes statewide for Democrats
That's
than
the
Republicans,
Republicans.
for congressional candidates?
But the districts were drawn in such a way so it concentrated the vote, the Democratic vote, in just a few districts. These weren't drawn on a racial basis. These were drawn on political gerrymandering. That the Republicans actually got about 70% of the congressional seats in those 3 states, even though they did not get a majority of the vote.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. You've got and one other thing, Dan, that I know you want to let the others talk, is that, and I don't question that.
Yeah.
We made 3 suggestions. We made 3 suggestions. And this gerrymandering thing outside the South could flip in 10 years if Democrats take control of the legislatures. We suggested the Congress pass a statute requiring bipartisan commissions to draw congressional lines in every single state. It's done in 5 states right now, and it's worked reasonably well in those states. We recommended that there be full disclosure by every organization, C4s right now, which aren't required to disclose, if they ever take an ad, a newspaper ad, a radio or a television ad, a direct mail piece that mentions a federal candidate by name, they have to disclose all their donors. We also called for a national primary date. And the reason for that is that primaries right now are low turnout, and so that independents don't vote in primaries, and you have a very small, in most states, and you have a very small number of people who actually do vote in primaries. And if you would have a national primary day, there would be more media attention focused on those, on the primaries, and you presumably would have a larger turnout, and that might well produce more moderate candidates.
Before I get to the others, I would just want to ask you one question.
Yeah.
In the last end of legislative session, the big comprehensive bill that was passed to fund the government substantially increases the amount of money that can be contributed to political parties. I don't know by what quantum level, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. Do you 2 folks think that's a good idea?
I think it's a good idea. I think the more money you give to political parties are centralizing forces in our country.
Yeah.
As long as it's completely disclosed, I think we're better off if that money is given to political parties in a publicly disclosed way than if it's spent on the fringes and not disclosed.
And Tom?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the argument. Give it to the parties, make it full disclosure.
And you think that may drive down some of the money that's given to the more extreme groups?
Well, this is a pretty modest proposal. I mean, parties still have a small cap on it, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
You can't put the genie back in the bottle. You can't just by saying now people can give more money to political parties. That's not in and itself going to prevent people who now have gotten used to writing very large checks to these outside groups that are totally uncontrolled by the parties. They'll still be doing that.
Okay.
But it makes it a little bit fairer if the parties have more money.
So now I want to turn to the people who are in the vineyards right now, toiling, trying to make America a better place to live. And first of all, I want to call on Greg Walden. By the way, congratulations. So your party's won very large victories. I believe that you have the largest margins in modern history.
Since the 20s.
And for sure since the 40s and maybe since the 20s. So comment on what these folks have said. Not on your success, because I'm sure that you take personal credit for all the victories that were done there.
And rightfully so.
But as a Republican member of the House, you now have a large majority in the House and a majority in the Senate as well. How do you comment on the institution itself, how it's working? Is it much worse than it was when you came here in 1998? And, so.
All right, thank you. And thanks to Martin and Tom and Rich for writing the book. It's a good read. If you haven't gotten it yet, I don't think we're allowed by our ethics laws to promote it, but it's a good read. It's a good read. Let me take it from a couple of angles. So I chair the House Campaign Committee, did so in this last cycle. And you're right and you're wrong. I now am a big fan of Larry Sabato because he said you count the number based on the election. And so we had 247 House Republicans when all the ballots were finally counted and the Arizona race was the last. Then Michael Grimm stepped down, so that put us at 246.
From Staten Island.
From Staten Island.
Yeah.
So we have a vacancy right now. So we were both 247, which is on the campaign side, we'll claim credit for that number. But we're back to 46. So that takes you to 1946 levels. That's the highest majority Republicans since 46. The other one is since Babe Ruth was swinging bats. And we'll have a chance to get back to that if Governor Cuomo declares there's a vacancy and schedules a special election, which I hope he will do soon. A couple of things I'd like to point out. So I actually worked on staff on the Hill in the 1980s, early 80s. And I kind of took note of what Martin said about my friend Pat Roberts. because I think there's more to the story there. And part of it is members in the House or the Senate who no longer own a home in their own states. We've seen this play out in Indiana with Dick Lugar. You saw it in that race. That was a fundamental part of that race, is people didn't think he was still connected to the state. Now, the voting pattern, yes, I think there's probably some change there. The campaign I was on in 1980...
So you think it's more complicated than just...
I think it's much more complicated than that. And so in the campaign I was on in 1980, the person I worked for took on the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, who had been in this seat for 24 years. By the way, didn't own a home in Oregon. He'd won 70% unopposed, time after time after time. He'd only come home 13 times in the prior 2 years. Because in the old days, your budget was siloed, and you didn't get trips anytime you wanted and all that. So Denny Smith beat Al Ullman by about a point in the landslide year of 1980, but the central issue was he'd lost touch, didn't own a home there. So I think in these races there is more to it. I hope we get into deeper in the book, but let me conclude, because you ask about the makeup of Congress. Is there gridlock? Yeah, there's been gridlock. Is it partly because of what our constitutional founders gave us in terms of Senate versus House and the rules? We can do in a day or a few hours what the Senate literally will take 4 weeks to get to, maybe. So there's that frustration out there, and Tom's right. With the media, everybody knows everything instantly now, which didn't used to be the case. And remember, for 40 years, the Democrats controlled the House. They did so according to this incredible archival book we have now. In all but 6 years, the first 6, they had no fewer than 243 members in the House.
In 1978, my first re-election, we had 294 Democrats. I
So when I worked, so so I'm going to get into this nostalgia piece a little bit.
Yeah.
I remember Denny Smith coming back from the House Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, where he said, "Can you imagine a job where every day you went to work, you knew you were going to lose? They were outnumbered 2-1. It was 1981." And so when you kind of stand back, you go, well, of course everybody got along. There was no reason not to, because chairs had proxy voting, nobody had to show up. I mean, it was a different world and a different media environment. I think it all changed, obviously, in '94. And a concluding note, because I know we want to get to Chris here. I remember my father, who was in the state legislature and in the radio business and all, used to talk about the tiger of the Senate, Wayne Morris, who was a Republican, independent, and eventually a Democrat. And he would come home in the 60s and 70s, and if anybody ever raised an issue at a meeting about how he had voted, his standard reply was, if you'd been there on the Senate floor and you'd heard the debate I heard, you would have voted the way I voted. What do you say? The problem we face today, and it's not a bad one for democracy necessarily, is our constituents probably have seen the debate more than we have, because we've been meeting with other constituents. So the world's changed, and I think that's part of the whole equation here.
Okay.
But I'll stop with that for now.
So we've got Chris, who represents suburban Maryland district. You don't have the luck of being able to get away from things. You can't go out to dinner without constituents.
I hope we have some here.
Yeah, that's right. Well, all of his constituents raised their hand. Okay, all right. But this is actually not officially a campaign rally for Chris. But Chris is an exceptionally talented individual and very media savvy. And I've always thought that Chris would have been extremely happy in the House back in the days when I was there, when you could offer amendments to every bill. It didn't matter how junior you were. Every rule was open for the most part. I mean, back in the early days, it was pretty open. Martin, even though you're an old Rules Committee guy. But so now, Chris, you have gone to the deep minority, so to speak, in the last 2 years. How do you perceive your role, and how do you perceive the issues that folks have been talking about here?
Well, first, thanks for rubbing it in, Dan. And as my friend Greg said, it's tough.
You
to
weren't
be on
chairman of the
losing
campaign
end.
committee the last 2 years,
No,
though, so I want
that's
to make
very
that
true.
clear. Yeah.
So I also do want to start by thanking Tom and Martin and Rich for writing this book, because I do think it has lots of very important insights and some important recommendations. And Dan, it's great to see you, and some of our former colleagues here. Great to see all of you. And let me just start on a bipartisan note, which is Greg and I both believe firmly, and we are united on this, that January 10th is the best birthday to have, because we both share January 10th as a birthday. And I should say we celebrated. Roy Blunt, now in the Senate, started a tradition where every January 10th we all get together on a bipartisan basis. There are about 6 of us. And celebrate birthday. And Greg was good enough to host us in his nice new office, which I hope to get back someday. No, but seriously, we were able to have a gathering. And so...
Just for the record, though, I would point out I've actually celebrated it more often than he has.
I'll tell you, we also had made common cause in the fact that Greg took this particular piece of real estate from the Rules Committee.
That's
so
right.
we were both pleased that that was a... Let me just say a couple things. First of all, I think that the issues that these gentlemen have identified are real. I mean, I think we all know that there's no silver bullet to trying to make Congress work in a more functional way. I also think, as we all know, if you look back at history, you can find those times when members of Congress were literally caning each other. But I do believe we're in a particularly tough period right now. So just for some solutions, I think that the redistricting problem is real. I don't think it's not a panacea to solve it, but we should address this issue. And both parties are equal opportunity exploiters of redistricting. I mean, Republicans have gotten the better of Democrats in recent years, but I should just, in the state of Maryland, in the last redistricting, the lines were redrawn, and as a result of the line redrawing, the district I represent is not just suburban Maryland right now. I go all the way from the Maryland-D.C. border to the Pennsylvania Maryland border, and a new district was carved out going up the Potomac River, and John Delaney defeated a Republican incumbent in the state of Maryland. But I do believe that we should reform that system. And I do believe in national legislation for nonpartisan line drawings. In fact, there's a piece of legislation that's been introduced to do exactly that. It was introduced originally by John Tanner, a member of Congress from Tennessee, and now it's another member of Tennessee, Jim Cooper. So I'm a co-sponsor of that legislation. I think that would be a step forward. Campaign finance reform. I think the argument with respect to McCain-Feingold, I have a different take on it, but the argument that our colleagues are making is one that has become, more pronounced. I disagree, but Citizens United changed the dynamic with respect to McCain-Feingold in some ways. And my view is we should be working on trying to find ways to roll back, although it's not easy to roll back, obviously, the worst parts of the consequences of Citizens United. Today is the 5-year anniversary of the passage of Citizens United, one of what I think is the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. And it opened the door to massive spending by, corporations, the 501c4s, the C in 501c4s corporation. And it created a consequence that 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices suggest that they never intended, which is all the secret money flowing into campaigns. And I say 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices in that case didn't intend it because if you read their opinion, they fully support 8 of the 9, Justice Clarence Thomas being the only exception, the idea of full transparency and disclosure in campaign contributions for independent expenditures as well as contributions made to candidates. And so today, I reintroduced, again, a piece of legislation called the Disclose Act. That's pretty simple. It says voters have a right to know who's spending this gobs of secret money to try and influence voters. For the life of me, I don't understand why we can't get bipartisan support in Congress for it, because you have bipartisan support throughout the country. Republicans, Democrats, and Independents overwhelmingly agree that voters should know who's trying to spend all this money to influence their vote. So I think passage of that legislation would be a step forward. So there are concrete measures out there to address some of these things, but I don't think that's, as I said, there's no silver bullet. And I will just end with this, and this is my colleague here may feel compelled to disagree with me, but I do see that in this book, both Tom and Martin and Richard, suggest that, which is that, both parties do have members that, are farther to one wing or the other, right? I mean, both parties have members that are on the wings. But I think it's indisputable, and there's been a lot written by nonpartisan scholars, that today within the Republican Party, you do have in the Tea Party a much more intense pull toward one part of the Republican Party. And I say that as somebody who used to work as a staff member for Mac Mathias from Maryland. And when I was running for
Republican senator.
Former Republican senator from the state of Maryland, when I was running for re-election one time, I was asked who was a role model. I said Mac Mathias. My Republican opponent sort of said, no way, he was, like an accommodationist or something, because he wanted to compromise. And I guess my point is, if you run in a congressional race on a platform of no compromise, you have to deliver on no compromise if you want to keep your promise. And I would suggest to you, if you look at campaigns today, I think it's indisputable, there are many more of our Republican colleagues on the Tea Party side, for the reasons Tom said, very scared of their primaries, who run on a platform of no compromise. And then they get here and they have to deliver for their constituents. So I would suggest that while I'm sure these swings can take place in both parties over, if you look back over history, that right now it's particularly pronounced in
I think Tom wanted to comment
on I appreciate
Chris's.
Remarks by both of you. A couple of observations. One is, the point we're trying to make is that the parties have become basically parliamentary parties. People are voting the party and not the person in many of these races. It doesn't help in a primary when you don't go home. But Roberts won the general election after a lot of money spent against him from an independent with Democratic support. That in fact, general elections are parliamentary elections. And you have very few Republicans sitting in Democratic districts and vice versa, as you did just a decade ago, let alone 2 decades ago.
You have 25 Republicans in seats that Barack Obama won.
Right.
You have 5 Democrats in seats that Mitt Romney won post-2014.
And that's a low when you look at that historically.
And those are the seats that will be targeted by the DCCC in the next election.
Oh, thanks for your help.
Yeah. But to give you some idea on this, in 1984, I had got 67% of the vote in my district, and Ronald Reagan got 66% of the vote in my district.
And
that does not happen anymore, I don't think.
And we have a chart in the book where Reagan was getting over 70% of the vote, and Democrats were winning the districts. So I think that's pretty indisputable that this has been the trend. There are a handful of exceptions left, but most of these guys, Matheson left. I mean, your folks, we won a seat in Georgia. Earl Pomeroy was in a district. People liked him, but they just wanted a Republican, and that's what occurs. But what this means is, when members come to Washington now, they act like parliamentary, which means instead of being the minority party, you're now the opposition party. You take a look at the number of filibusters in the Senate by the minority party, whoever it is, almost everything is filibustered. You're no longer a minority shareholder in government, where you're trying to mitigate bad policies.
Sure.
So I think that is what has occurred. Is the problem is we're a balance of powers government. We're not a parliamentary system.
So then how do you explain Heidi Heitkamp as a Democrat winning in the same state?
She is the equivalent of a good old boy.
Well, I will explain.
She fit that state.
But Earl's a good old boy.
Let me explain it. I'll explain it. No, Earl got caught up in the biggest Republican off year since 1938.
There you go.
And that was, Heitkamp was a presidential year. But remember, North Dakota and Maine are 2 real exceptions. Susan Collins. If you take, we have a chart in there, what we call the blue wall states. These are the 18 states that have voted Democrat for president now, 6 straight elections. It's a 32-4 Senate lineup. 3 of those 4 Republicans are up next time. They came in on the 2010 wave. Wisconsin, Illinois, Pennsylvania, all at risk. On the 13 red wall states, these are states that have voted for president 6 straight times Republicans. It's 25-1. Heidi Heitkamp, who won by less than 1%, being the only exception. But North Dakota is a small state. Until recently, it wasn't a transient state, just like Maine is for Collins, where you can still personalize things. These larger states, it becomes almost impossible. So that would be the way that I would explain it. I just say, Chris, my comment on the Republicans being right now a little more, having a more boisterous wing base than the Democrats, it's masked because the Democrats are acting like a parliamentary party behind Obama. And they have a president that holds them in line. I think if you take Obama away and make them the minority party, those problems that the Republicans have now without a leader start infecting the Democratic Party in a more transparent
let me enlarge
fashion.
on
Republicans fall behind their leader.
All right.
Let me enlarge
but
on
not too
one
long.
point
Yeah.
that Tom's made.
Yeah, okay.
When he talks about a parliamentary system, you have to understand exactly what he means. Under parliamentary systems, in most countries, you have unitary government. Whatever party or coalition of parties has the majority in the parliament also has the prime minister. You don't have a president of one party and a parliament of another party. So our system wasn't set up that way. Our system was set up as a separation of powers so that you can have a president of one party and a Congress of another party. But the congressmen now are acting like, in many cases, like they were in a parliamentary system where all they do is support their party and not cast independent judgment.
Okay.
I think that's what Tom
All
was
right.
trying to
So
say.
let me just, a couple things I want to talk about. I want to go back to money for a second because, you know, it's fine to talk about dark money, which is really bad, and it's time to talk about the amount of volume of money that's undisclosed. But, you know, you go out into the countryside, they talk about the fact that congressmen and senators and candidates for office are just sucking up money wherever they can find it, that the system has nothing but awash in money generically from whatever source it comes from. And that makes it difficult to be the voice of the people, so to speak. It makes it difficult to actually do the public's work. So to give you one idea, when I ran for Congress in 1976, I raised and spent $100,000 total and ran against an incumbent Republican congressman. That race would cost me $5 to $10 million today, probably, with all the money that's there. So that means that you have to spend your life doing nothing but raising money. Both sides do this. Doesn't that impact the ability of the system to be resilient and do the public's work? I asked you that question.
Dan, obviously the answer is yes. However, the public, if you ask the public, do you want public financing? Do you want to take private contributions out of the system? The answer is overwhelmingly no.
Yes.
They don't want their tax money being used to support a candidate for office. So we have the system that we have. We're not going to change that. Now, there was one exception. Barack Obama, when he ran in 2008, raised an extraordinary amount of money through the internet in small contributions. Yes. So it is possible, if you're a high-profile candidate, to raise a lot of money from small contributors. But that doesn't happen very easily or very often.
So we're basically then, we're in a sense stuck with the system we have.
We're stuck with the system we have.
And
You've
so
got
I wonder...
Buckley versus Vallejo. I mean, you have constitutional law on this that individuals can spend as much of their own money as they want under freedom of speech. So, so a system of public financing really doesn't work. And you found with Obama that once he found he was disadvantaged by taking the match, he decided, I'm going the other way. So, I mean, we have to deal with those rules.
And you have to understand the Citizens United case that permitted corporations to give unlimited amounts to what are called C4 organizations. That's the law of the land. And the only way you could change that, and Chris, I know that you would like to find a way to change it, the only way you can change that is to amend the U.S. Constitution to override Citizens United. It is very hard to amend the Constitution in this country. It almost never happens. An amendment has to have 2/3 vote in each house and be voted by 3/4 of the states. So you're stuck with that until the Supreme Court changes its mind, and there's no indication that the Supreme Court is going to change its mind on this particular subject any time. So that's why we stress that disclosure is really the only remedy to the system we currently have.
I want to talk a little bit about civility for a moment because, you know, I work part-time at a place called the Bipartisan Policy Center. We try our best. We've come up with a series of recommendations to deal with this issue about if people like each other, if they talk to each other, if they socialize with each other, they're less likely to have birthdays together and that kind of thing. Exactly. Because, you know, it's an interesting, Martin talked about this, but our system was kind of set up not to work very well. We have separation of powers, checks and balances. Nobody can trump anybody else. And in fact, we split the Congress up because the Founding Fathers thought there'd be a tyranny of the Congress. So they made 2 bodies there, and we split it with the president. And so, given that, it's hard to get a lot done under our system anyway. That's the way the Founding Fathers wanted it. They didn't want a parliamentary system where it was too easy to get things done, and then the tyranny of the king or of the speaker of the parliament, head of the parliament, would be a problem. So, given that, in order for the system to work, the system to grease, people have to learn to work together. And I'd like you all to comment on this issue of likability, friendship, civility, working together. Is it as bad as what people say it is? Because it strikes me that there's still a lot of relationship building that does take place. But the heart of this political system is people having trust with each other and working together. And I'm trying to figure out is there anything there we could do better than we're currently doing?
I'm going to give a short answer. Let's give plenty of time for everybody else. In 1964 and in 1965, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. In both cases, that was done with a combination of Democratic and Republican votes. Those bills would not have passed without Republican votes in the United States Senate because Southern Democrats at that time were opposed to civil rights. Lyndon Johnson romanced Everett McKinley Dirksen to a fairly well, went to him and said, Ev, you're from the land of Lincoln. You've got to be for civil rights. And in fact, Dirksen delivered the votes to break the filibuster against civil rights in the Senate.
He was actually the #1 signature on the cloture motion.
So can we have that? The question is, can we have something like that happen today? I don't know. I think we probably better ought to hear from the current members. Tom and I are less optimistic about that type thing happening today.
But you guys seem to like each other. I mean, no institution, no organization can work if people don't get along. It just doesn't happen. It breaks down. I wonder if you might comment about this.
Well, let me just, so first of all, I do like Greg. And I do think that there is, in my view, plenty of civility in the United States Congress. So, for example, if you were to come to the Budget Committee, where Paul Ryan was the chairman of the committee, I was ranking member. We have very sharp debates on budget issues, but they're civil, and we actually get along personally very well. I mean, we go out to dinner, we talk about issues. So I think there is a lot of that relationship development. Now, it is true that you don't have as many members of Congress living in the Washington, D.C. area as you used to, because a lot of them, when they did that, they got criticized back home for going local, for going Washington, and so they do spend more time on the plane going back home. But I do not subscribe to the theory that just, more opportunities to sit down for dinner or birthdays is enough to overcome some of the political differences that are between the parties right now. And there was this criticism of the president that, if only he had wined and dined, members of either party more, that he would have been able to pass more of his agenda. I just don't buy it. In fact, the president then launched his, so-called charm offensive, and he actually took people to restaurants and paid the bill, and they all talked, and it didn't overcome the very real and obvious differences between the parties. So. Don't get me wrong. The more communication, the more socializing, the better. I just don't think that overcomes the other sort of trends and pressures in the system. That
I want Greg to comment, and then Tom, I'll get you.
No, I think Chris is right, and we are friends, but we represent different districts. Yeah. I mean, that's what people forget. There's a reason a member acts the way they act. They got elected to represent the people in their district. You can't come here and say, well, you're now my friend and you represent a different district, you have a different philosophy, so I'm going to vote like you do. It doesn't work. And I'll tell you what, I have a degree in journalism, like others on this panel. And it's, part of what we face in this world is what's newsworthy. If we're getting along, you're not going to write about that. If the lights go out in the city of Washington, there's a story. If they're on, it's not a story. If he takes a poke at me tonight, Rich is going to write about it before we're out of the building. If we all get along here, nobody's going to care. And so I think there's that element. I think, though, that there's a lot of camaraderie among colleagues. where you have completely different districts. On that trip I went with you on when you were Secretary of Agriculture to China, Greg Meeks was on that trip. Now, none of us thought it was exactly the wisest idea for Greg to go door to door in Beijing to
He
find
went
out.
door to door, and he was a congressional candidate.
Find out what
and
the
he
people-
knocked on doors and he asked people this question: do you like China? We're in China, and asked him, do you like China? And the answer one person said was wonderful. He said, of course, we're Chinese. And, so.
But he and I are, I would say, good friends. We kid each other all the time, and we both threaten to come campaign for the other in the other's district. He's got up there by JFK, and I got this 69,341 square mile rural district. But you know what? We actually joined on some issues because of that, some successful issues, because we did get to know each other. So that is a part of this. And if you do know somebody, you're not going to take the cheap shot you might otherwise fall into taking. But I think you always have to step back and go, why does somebody behave the way they behave? Some of it's just their quirky personality, but some of it is they're just representing the people that sent them here, and that's their responsibility. So they can't vote your way. But there's sure a lot of ground in the middle where we get a lot of work done.
Yeah. Let's see. I think Tom wanted to comment on that.
I mean, just a couple of them. One of the things we suggest in the book, it's kind of against people's nature, is bring back earmarks, because everybody then has skin in the game. And somebody's going to earmark this somewhere along the line, whether it's a local government or President Obama or somebody. And since Congress is appropriating the money, why not put some project designations and hold things together? It made the appropriations process go a lot smoother, and it brought a lot of people together because they had some commonality in the final outcome. Since they've been taken away, it's been a lot harder to pass appropriation bills, and they're getting done later and later. The other thing I'd add is the media is a culprit here, because where else do you yell, you lie, in the State of the Union, and you raise $1 million online the next week? We have got to come to grips that there are rewards sometimes for bad behavior, the way this has worked out. But I think for the most part, you're right. Most members want to get along. They try hard. I'm a part of No Labels. We get Republicans and Democrats together and talk about what can we agree on. But there are sharp disagreements. That's why I'm a Republican and Martin is a Democrat. We have real differences that are hard to bridge, but we can do a better job. That's the point.
But Greg, your point is that people are reflecting their districts. I accept that. The problem is the districts are drawn in such a way that they're not reflective of the country. In 2012, Democrats got 1.4 million more votes for Congress than the Republicans, and yet the Republicans wound up with a 17-point margin, a 17-seat margin. It was because of the way the districts were drawn. And there are a lot of things that could be done, not just go to bipartisan commissions, but look at what California has done. California has a system now where everybody can run regardless of party, and the top two then are in a runoff. You could have 2 Republicans, you could have 2 Democrats. If you have multiple candidates, it's more likely that a more moderate centrist candidate will wind up being one of the 2 candidates in the finals. Whereas under the old system, and this was true for years, is that there were Democratic districts and there were Republican districts in California. There was a gentleman's agreement, so to speak, where each party said, we'll protect our incumbents, we won't make any competitive districts. The entire race was in the primary, and it didn't make any difference. And the primaries tended to produce people on the left in the Democratic Party, people on the right in the Republican Party, and not moderates who are in the middle, who might have a chance of coming to Washington and striking a bargain with the other side. That's a controversial proposition. Louisiana has had that system in recent years, but Louisiana is a southern state, so the Republicans are going to win in Louisiana.
It's a voting rights state.
And it's a southern state. The 2 candidates are likely to both be Republicans in the runoff. You're not likely to have a Democrat and a Republican. But in some states, in the Midwest, some states in the Northeast, some states in the West, if you went to the system of the top 2, then get in a runoff, you might conceivably produce more congressmen who are willing to talk to the other side.
Let me make just 2 quick questions. One is, I'm not here about producing more moderates necessarily. I think it's good to have conservatives and liberals, but sooner or later you got to get to a deal. Yeah. And the problem we have now is it's hard to get to a deal on anything. It's hard to get people to get out of their comfort zone and make those tough votes. And we give several illustrations of that in the book. But conservatives and liberals can come to deals. There's no reason you can't get an appropriation bill out in time, and you have to hold up the government every year just because
so
everybody's got to
let me
say
ask
it.
Can I just follow up?
All right,
on
go
that?
ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
go
On
ahead.
that. I don't disagree with you. The other thing I hear, and I don't know if you hear this, is I don't want to have to go home and explain it.
Right.
And I've taken some of these tough votes as we've gone forward, and I've gone home and done the work to go explain them, and some of those have been pretty hot meetings. And so there are some members that just, it's easier just to, not take the heat. But when I've gone home, when we did that tax bill, the one that, I don't remember what we titled it, but the one that locked in all the tax rates other than on the upper income, I had people just furious because it had been spun out there what it was, which wasn't what it was. And when I went back and explained it point by point by point, you could just feel the heat drain away mostly.
So you think there's some fear of actually facing the public by some members?
Not only that, but it's work.
Right.
Now, I don't mean that in a bad way. You have to go back and explain your vote. And if you're not energetic, shall I say, if you're not used to going back to your district, maybe you just don't want to take the heat.
Yeah.
So there's more to this than just redistricting.
Okay, I want to ask.
There's about a little,
Sure.
willingness
One
to do
final
the
area
work.
before we get to Q&A. This may be process-oriented, but there's always this discussion about regular order falling apart,
Right.
not allowing members to vote. There's been a special allegation on Harry Reid that he's not allowed votes to come up for fear of protecting people from taking tough votes. And in the House, although I think it's gotten better in the last couple of years, virtually no rules were open. It was closed. Everything was closed. And, it was so different when I came to work every day. As a freshman, I could offer amendments on about everything, and I did. And sometimes they were crazy, sometimes they were okay, but whatever, I felt empowered. Like I was a member of Congress that actually could come and do work. And I wonder if that is something, what are we doing in that area?
You make our case, though, because if it's in a parliamentary system, the president's party, they rule, so you write the bills from the leader's office, you don't give the other party a chance to offer, and you get your work product out the door. And that is what we've devolved into, is the party that controls the floor, and they control all the action. We'll see how it works now with the Republicans not controlling the White House, trying to open it up and see, how it's abused and how it works out. I think there's going to be an effort to do that. But Harry Reid was simply protecting the presidency and not allowing these embarrassing amendments to come up and making sure he could control outcomes.
But Dan, you're right. And every person who's run for speaker since Newt Gingrich in 1994 has run on a platform of let's go back to regular order, let's open up the process, let's have amendments. And every person who's been elected speaker has subsequently not done that. Has largely closed down the process. You don't have very many bills on the House floor where you have a lot of amendments these days.
So we did change the rules. We did go back to more regular order than what we had, especially on the appropriations process, which had been screwed down to where there was a limitation on the number of amendments on appropriation bills. We opened it back up where now appropriation bill comes to the floor. It's under an open rule. Right?
Just to be clear, because we have some difference here. I don't often quote Louis Goldmark from Texas, but as he pointed out on the floor of the House just the other day, you guys have now broken the record on closed rules from the period before. But look,
the appropriations process was open.
The way it was when Dave Obey was doing it, it was also open. What we ended up having to do was negotiate between the parties. No. He was willing to go on. At some point, we negotiated a time agreement like they do in the Senate because there were so many. That was negotiated between the parties. But I would argue it's absolutely true. Everybody who's in the minority party runs on a platform of more regular order. And when they're initially elected, for a while they try and do it, but with all respect, right now in the House you have almost all closed rules on anything that's controversial.
But
appropriations.
We can say that about when Obamacare came through. Huh? When the biggest change in health care in history came through, not a single amendment we offered was allowed by the Rules Committee to debate it on the floor.
My point.
Well, you guys appropriately made a big deal about it, and now you're doing the same thing. Let's see. Reconciliation. You may try and repeal it.
We still get along. We still have a birthday on the same day. We still do. We just see things differently.
Dan and I were elected about at the same time. Dan was elected in 1976. I was elected in 78. At that time, you had authorization bills, bills that created new laws, that authorized programs.
Laws, yes.
And those would go under largely on open rules. Now, the only thing that goes under anything approaching an open rule is an appropriations bill. All the work of the Congress is done during the appropriations process. There's no major authorization bill in recent years, I don't believe, who's gone to the floor with the opportunity for members to actually amend that. And that's been true depending on, no matter which party is controlled. When I was in 2005, the year after I left the Congress, actually, it was when Pelosi became Speaker, which would have been 2006, in the 2006 election. That next spring, I went to the University of Missouri, where I went to school, and I gave a speech at the University of Missouri, and the topic of my speech was Gingrich and Pelosi, two peas in a pod, and that they both viewed the speakership exactly the same way, as top-down, out of the Speaker's office, very little opportunity for the average rank-and-file member to influence legislation.
They were interested in outcomes, Martin. They're not in inputs.
I understand, not in giving members the opportunity
the hallmarks of a parliamentary system.
All right, we need to get to questions and answers, and we have mics on either side. If you have a question, I'd ask you to make sure it is a question. It has a subject and a predicate, and not many subjects and predicates. And if you might state your name and where you're from, so to speak. Yes, sir.
Hi, David Lowe. I'm from Washington, D.C. How many of the problems that you're describing here are attributable to the simple fact that the country is so evenly divided politically? I mean, Congressman Walden pointed out that in the old days, 30 years ago, you had a clear majority party and a clear minority party. Now it's more of a 49-49 country. Yeah. So how would you assess that?
Now, for my colleagues up here, my friend Dave used to teach government. So he asked a very good question.
So does somebody have a...
I will just say the parties today are ideologically sorted. You go back 20 years, they weren't. There were a lot of different reasons. There had conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans, and the issues were not as ideological there. But with the parties being ideologically sorted and the country being closely divided, I think it's the combination of both.
And
yeah, well,
Chris?
I just add, look, there are two reasons you have congressional districts that seem to, the overwhelming majority of which go strongly toward one party or the other. One is this sort of geographic sorting. I mean, the reality is you have Democrats more concentrated in some of the urban and suburban areas, Republicans rural. That's one. But the other is redistricting, and it is a component. In other words, if you had the 49-51 split or 50-50 split, but you put a blindfold on and drew the districts, you'd probably have some districts that were more competitive because you'd have more of a even balance within those congressional districts. Whereas if you take that 50-50 split and you draw the districts in a way where some are get much more of the Republicans than the Democrats, then the members of those districts aren't reflecting the mixed view. So that is why this idea of a nonpartisan redistricting approach, I believe, will address some of the issues. It's, again, none of these things by themselves will be so.
Yes, sir, over there.
And there is legislation. I want to stress, because we're identifying problems, but there are proposals in the Congress on disclose, on creating a nonpartisan redistricting that would address these. Maybe we can get some bipartisan support tonight.
Can I just weigh in on this for a second? Because we also have to step back and look. 218 is majority in the House. We're at the biggest majority we've ever had, 246 right now. We were at 234. Well, you're talking 17, 18 seats that you guys needed to pick up, take the majority back. A lot of people at one point thought you were going to. This thing is flip-flop back and forth. It's pretty close, even with the redistricting that's occurred. And by the way, nobody's talked about the Chicago-driven redistricting in Illinois that was just as much a gerrymander.
We acknowledge that it's been done on both sides.
I know. I just didn't hear Illinois ever get mentioned in this discussion. And I thought I just want to leave out any
Republicans
state.
done a little more recently, but the Democrats have done this historically.
Same cycle.
Right.
Same cycle.
Correct. Yes, sir, over there.
I agree with the, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with the idea, the discussion about...
Tell us where you're from.
Yeah, name.
I'm Dennis McGovern, and I'm from Washington, presently from Washington, D.C. The comment about the parties being more ideologically divided, I think it's incorrect. I think, having grown up in Buffalo, a working class union family, we were very much ideologically, economically divided from the Republican Party. What has happened in the Democratic side, I believe, is that it has become identity politics, socially divided. The main groups are, which aren't represented on the panel, by the way, African American, gay, lesbian, and feminist. And on the Republican side, very much anti that, and perceived by Democrats that they are social conservatives running on issues like abortion and anti-gay rights. Does that make any sense?
Somebody could comment. Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense, and one of the things that Tom talks about at great length in the book is the divided government, is the fact that Democrats have an advantage, not necessarily a permanent advantage, but an advantage in presidential politics, and Republicans have an advantage in congressional politics currently. And one of the reasons on the presidential level is that the composition of the electorate has changed pretty dramatically in the last 20 years. In 1992, the electorate for the whole country was 87% white. 20 years later, it was 72% white. And so the electorate has become more diverse, and that's why it's very hard for the Republicans, not impossible, for the Republicans to win a presidential race, because they're fishing in a decreasing pond trying to maximize white voters. If the Republicans can ever figure out how to make inroads in the Hispanic community, which they have not been able to do in recent years, they could be very competitive in presidential races, but they haven't figured that out.
Tom, did you want? One of you wanted to comment on that?
Look, I think the Democrats practice a brand of identity politics that I think they've been good about. When you take a look at congressional voting, in terms of voting on issues as ranked by National Journal, what you're going to find is the most liberal Republican is more conservative than the most conservative Democrat in both the House and the Senate. And this is a pattern that has been building over the last 20 years. And now I think it's at a crescendo.
Just to comment on you, I'm looking at my friend Earl Pomeroy here from North Dakota, but if you look at the map of the country, if you look at the area between the coasts,
that's right.
there are virtually no Democrats in Congress or the Senate.
Except in the big cities.
Yeah, entire heartland of the country, the states. I mean, there are some exceptions, obviously. And these are areas that used to be populated with a lot of Democrats.
Dan, let me take it one step further. Republicans dominate rural America today with three major exceptions. Majority-minority counties, Black, Hispanic, Indian majority counties.
In the South.
In the North, too.
Yeah.
I mean, you take a look at Shannon County, North Dakota. We can get in South Dakota. Those are the rural areas that Democrats carry. They carry college towns, and they carry the granola belt. That's Aspen, Vale, Sun Valley, Idaho, and these Blaine County, Idaho, Teton County.
This is a man that knows his country, that's for sure.
Well, I was campaign chairman. But that is it, which goes back to the essentials of these being cultural alignments. As I said at the beginning, race, ethnicity, culture define basically a political identification more than economics. I just mapped out last year the 100 poorest counties in the country. The white ones voted for Romney. The Democrats were carrying the Black, Indian, and Hispanic poor counties, and that's just a fact.
But the truth is that the country the electorate is becoming much more diverse.
Yes.
And the Republicans are going to have to figure out how to deal with that if they're going to elect a president.
We agree on that.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a master's student at Georgetown, but I'm originally from the North Carolina 7th, which was held by a Blue Dog for a long time, my former boss, and has just switched over to a Republican. My question is, and we've kind of hit on this, that we've seen how Republican behavior and voting patterns and rhetoric have changed since the emergence of the Tea Party. Do you think that this similar phenomenon could happen as the Progressive Party grows on with the Democratic Party? Or the Democrat?
Take that one.
Could you?
Well, I'll take. So you worked for Mike
Yes.
McIntyre.
We all agree he was a very good guy.
Yes, he was.
Yes.
Good guy.
Yes, he was. I don't see that happening in the near term. I think obviously the Democratic Party has a great sort of diversity of opinion, but I do not see, at least in the near term, a situation where sort of that there's a rise of the equivalent in the Democratic Party of the sort of Tea Party wing of the Republican Party that has the kind of, intense ability to push districts in a particular direction. I don't see that. Obviously, as the discussion we've had here is there are people. Primaries are obviously important, and if you have a congressional district that is a great majority of one party, Republican or Democrat, the primary is important. But I haven't seen, at least among my colleagues right now, the same fear of somebody running against them in the primary to the far left as you see a lot of our colleagues on the far right. Not that. I mean, I remember it was back to civility. You know, I would walk over to the votes on the House floor, and there's a guy who's a regular elevator companion, and we walk over and talk about a lot of things and family. And this is a guy, a Republican, who won with a huge Tea Party vote the first time he won in 2010, that big election, 2010. And he has got probably 100% conservative voting record. So before the last election, I'm walking over with him, and he goes, "God, Chris, you know, you think I'm a Tea Party guy? You should see the guy running against me." And sure enough, here's a guy with almost 100%, I think 100% conservative rating, worried about someone running. So I as I said, both parties have, folks on the wings, but right now you have more of that phenomenon on the Republicans. I think that's pretty undisputable in this particular historical period.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I'm going to ask the question, and then I'm going to tell
Your
you
name.
why. Oh, Kenneth Rothschild. I'm from Washington, D.C. I'm going to ask the question, then I'm going to explain why I'm asking this question.
Try to keep it fairly brief.
I will keep it, but it needs a little background. The question is, how are we ever going to get a governing system that is appropriate for the times and the needs of today? The reason I'm asking that is that when we go back to the founding of the country, we had a great debate and dialogue about the fundamentals of government and how you govern. We are so far away from that today that we're not focusing on how we're going to have a governing system that will give us the type of life that is available to us and everybody. So nobody represents the general welfare. There is, in other words, it's so parochial. This sounds, and it's not a criticism really, but this sounds like more of a debate of fairness for Democrats and Republicans, equal opportunity for Democrats and Republicans. And we are missing the mark.
So this is a deeper philosophical question
Yeah,
about
but
whether
it's
our
an important
government
one.
represents the people or not, basically. I wonder if anybody wants to comment on this?
I'll start, Dan, and it's not directly on point, but I often speak to student groups, to high school groups and to college groups. And one of the things I point out to them is that while we were a country founded in a revolution, the revolutionaries created a very conservative form of government, making it very hard to get things done. Bill has to pass both houses of Congress, has to go to a conference committee, has to come back for another vote, then it has to go to the president to be signed or vetoed. If he vetoes it, then it has to come back and Congress has to vote on whether to override. It is hard to make fundamental change in this country. Now, that was good for this country for a long time. We were not a banana republic. We were not a situation where someone could ride in on a white horse one day and change everything overnight. But the question you ask is a very legitimate question, is if we want to make some institutional changes, how do we do it? Because it's very hard to make institutional change in this country.
Well, and the voters are reacting in a parliamentary manner, which is sweeping changes. The times you're getting them is when one party controls the presidency, the House, and the Senate. That's when you're really getting one party in charge and they move their agenda. And the last three times that has happened, 1994, 2006, and 2010, the voters have voted them out. There's been too much change too fast. Members come here. We got some very, very good members. They are here for the right reasons. They just operate in a system where compromise becomes very, very difficult for them in terms of institutionally getting reelected.
That's good question. Yes, behind you. Yes, sir.
Hi, Bruce Guthrie from Silver Spring. The unanimous consensus here seems to be that things are becoming dysfunctional because of gerrymandering on one side and constantly needing to run, constantly needing money on the other side. So I'm speaking from total ignorance here. Based on that, the Senate, which doesn't have gerrymandering and only runs every 6 years, they should be able to get along much better. Do they, in fact, get along better?
They need two things. You need 60 votes in the Senate for most things, which is a higher. And secondly, we talked about residential sorting patterns or geographic sorting patterns. When you take a look at the states, only 4 states were within 5 points in the presidential election. The states have now divided into pretty solidly blue walls and red walls, not through gerrymandering, but just through the residential sorting patterns and the fact that people who think alike live alike. There's a book called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop that explains this kind of thing. And so that is taken hold in the Senate.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you look at some states, look at a presidential election these days, and look where the parties concentrate their resources. The reason why you have a 50-state map, but the battle comes down now to, 7 or 8 states, is because all the other states are, people have figured they're going to go Republican or Democrat because of the population of the state. Yeah. So I don't think it takes away entirely from the idea of congressional. As I said, I mean, look, nonpartisan congressional redistricting is not a silver bullet. I don't want to suggest it would. It is, but it would create more districts where you had more of a balance between the parties. Not a ton more,
Greg,
but some.
Yeah, let me make 2 points. One on the nonpartisan redistricting. Who appoints the members of the nonpartisan redistricting group? In some states, it equals out, so you got 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and then they pick the third one. There's always going to be some philosophy involved in somebody drawing the lines. I mean, there is, whether you're a judge, whatever. There's going to be, now you may be able to minimize and legislate around that. But, I give you an example. You're actually looking at a live, breathing, endangered species. I'm the only Republican elected in Oregon outside of state legislators. The last time my state voted for a Republican for president was Ronald Reagan's reelect in '84. Our last Republican governor passed away this last year. I think he was 92, and he left office in January of 1987. We have no statewide. So, Oregon's one of those sorted states, if you will, spelled correctly, that is pretty darn blue. And I think Maryland heretofore has been pretty darn blue, except now all of a sudden pops up a guy nobody thought was going to be governor who's Republican. So it does change out. And a lot of labels get thrown around, Tea Party this, progressive that, whatever. At the end of the day, we're all Americans. And I'll tell you what I witnessed in my district, in my state, was a reaction. I would say, I would have said it was equal and opposite, but it's bigger than that. The Tea Party, quote unquote, to what was happening in Washington with one-party control, not my party. And what I encountered were men and women who care a lot about this country. You may disagree with them on their positions, who got off their couches and got involved for the first time and said, I don't like what I see happening. And by the way, I don't like either party particularly. I'm not a party person. I'm a conservative and became an activist. One of these guys is an 80-year-old Marine who still ran the Marine Marathon. And he was all over myself. A great guy. And I finally sat him down and said, what if you were in the front line for 6 months and you're taking it every day, getting fired on every night, and then some fresh new recruit comes running up and says, let me tell you, you're going to go win this war. You're probably going to go, son, when you've been here a while, And he got it eventually. It's not as easy as it looks. And while we still agree and disagree on some things, that energy level was really a reaction. I'm going to tell you from what I saw as a Republican to frankly the push on the stimulus and Obamacare and some of these things. And it was people who had never been involved, weren't fans of either party, but they fundamentally were conservatives, and this is how they reacted.
Well, Move On started the same way.
Sure,
with the
against
Democrats.
Bush.
Same kind of thing.
Yeah. Let's see. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Nick Masterin. I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee, the 9th District. I think that's still held by Congressman Steve Cohen. I'm now a PhD student at GW. My question kind of is on that same coattails in terms of Americans' hyperbolic sensitivity to these types of changes that we're talking about. We've referenced, 1965 Civil Rights Act and the Democrats that were there. It was a very different Democratic Party, very different Republican Party, even going back as far as Nixon. This, however, is really my question in terms of the recent Tea Party and the recent struggles with the Republican Party and the Democratic Party at the state and local level especially. Is it so much that there is personal disagreement, ideological disagreement in Congress, or is there a structural deficiency in how you as congressmen and even former congressmen are able to relate your relationships, your birthdays together, or your stances on issues? Is there a divide between how to effectively communicate that, and if so, perhaps maybe actually investing in more digital media strategies? I know the presidency didn't even have an office up until 2010 or 2012 that dealt with that. I don't know the makeup of your congressional staffs, but is that a potential solution to actually getting people to go out and vote, and especially the young vote, and especially since the millennials are about to replace the baby boomers as the largest generation?
Let me start by saying that my family, part of my family was from Memphis. They haven't been there in a long time. My grandfather was in the liquor business in Memphis when Prohibition came in, decided he had to go into a new line of work, and that's how my family got to Texas. He moved to Texas and went into the women's clothing business, figuring retail was retail. But you ask a very interesting question. It's the young staffers, by and large, in congressional offices who understand what's happened in terms of new social media and try and get their bosses to be involved in this to the extent possible. One of the problems, and Tom talks about this actually more than I do, one of the problems with the internet is that the internet doesn't, in many cases, doesn't have an editor. Yes. And so that so much of the information that comes over the internet is not true. And so the public is exposed to all kinds of information, and they have to kind of figure this out. And it's very hard to do. I have some right-wing cousins in Texas, who are very fine people, who used to send me things that they'd read on the internet about terrible things about Congress. And I would have to patiently respond to them. Just because it was on the internet doesn't make it true, and let me tell you what the real story is. So this is a mixed blessing. But in terms of, we ought to use social media to the maximum extent possible on all elected levels, and it is harder for some of the older members of Congress to kind of get their arms around
So
that.
let me ask a variation on this theme, though. So if you're getting false information on the internet, how about in campaign ads, where most of the money is being raised and spent? Is that a constructive way to give people confidence that our political system is working? I mean, the truth
of move voters. I mean, they're used because they move voters. They get people at the gut level, and they move independent voters. That's why you.
I understand that, but does it edify? Does it augment the intellectual ability?
Of course
to
not.
Look at issues and that kind. What I'm trying to say is, do we have a little bit of the same problem what Martin talked about with the internet, with the fact that most of the money that's spent in politics is destructive in a sense?
Well, let the two most recent campaign chairs speak to that.
I just asked the question.
Yeah, it's a fair question.
Yeah.
You want to take crack at that?
I can, whatever you want to do.
So, look, I think if you look at most of the campaign ads on TV today, they obviously present, they're designed to present one side of the story that people think will move voters in support of their candidate and against the other candidate. I mean, it's an advocacy piece. It's not sort of here's this side of the story and here's that side of the story. I mean, the issue with campaign ads, which I have most trouble with, are the ones that you don't really have to identify who you are, and they're being funded by secret money. And that's why the secret money, I think, is a serious problem, because you can come up with an organization, called, Paid For by God Bless America. Sounds just great, but the voters have no clue who is secretly financing those ads. A member of Congress runs an ad. it says, you know, paid for by Van Hollen for Congress or Walden for Congress. If the DCCC or the National Republican Campaign Committee runs an ad, they also identify who they are, and you can go and find out who's contributing to those political party organizations.
And make an issue out of it.
And make an issue out of it. But with the independent expenditures, the secret money that's being spent, they can raise, first of all, much more than the candidates or the campaign committees, and they can spend that money in secret. That is, I think, very damaging to our democracy. And as I said at the beginning, 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices think it's damaging to our, and I don't see why, getting back to disclose, I don't want to get, I mean, that should not be, in my view, a partisan issue that voters have a right to know. If I could just quickly say with respect to the internet, and both the authors have write about this, and all 3 of them, you do, I think, in the media have this phenomena that probably has changed over time, right? I mean, I'm sure people have heard this before. You know, when, you know, a generation or 2 ago, you had the 3 networks, and the 3 networks, I mean, you know, on one hand, they filtered the news. On the other hand, they at least supposedly were trying to make an effort to present the news in a less ideological way. Now, whether they were successful or not, everyone can debate. But the idea was there's a certain amount of information that all Americans are getting, and you can then exercise your judgment on what's one way or best. The way this media is set up right now, the good news is you have a proliferation of information sources. Whatever you want, right? And on cable, you got Fox, you got MSNBC, you got CNN, and on the social media you do too. But right now on social media, which is the way a lot of younger people are getting the news, they can program in which outlets they want to have fed to them every day. And they can pick the ones that are ideologically consistent with them and ignore the others, just like, you know, people can just tune into the cable channel that they want. And the result is this self-reinforcing mechanism. People tune into talk radio that's, you know, and I do think that we've gotten away from people looking at the, you know, broader pieces that analyze both sides of the story and the facts, and that does worry me, not because it has the self-reinforcing mechanism.
This gentleman, last question right here.
I don't have an answer.
Good evening. My name's Gabriel Mendola. I'm a master's student at Georgetown in the American Government program. Seems to me we haven't really talked about in detail one of the main prescriptions the authors suggested to solve this problem. Seems like Congress might not be able to help themselves in this case with the inertia generated from partisan gerrymandering, all the dark money, and the new media. The authors attested that the public must provide clear direction if the prospects for congressional politics are to improve. And I'm asking if you could comment on that more deeply, and if you think that's realistic, and how the public could, in fact, generate this change.
Well, actually, that's a question for our moderator. And the reason, and I'll be glad to talk about it, but Dan has been one of the prime movers in the Bipartisan Policy Commission. And they did their own study. They made their own recommendations. Some of their members have traveled around the country promoting those. This is a serious problem, a serious issue, and it's hard to make changes. And Dan, you might talk a little bit about what your group did.
Well, there are a couple things beyond these subjects. One is the lack of civics education in this country. So a lot of young people are just not schooled into civics and what makes government work and how to just effectuate change. You know, I think when you look at the great Second World War and what Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation, a lot of it was based on service. So we had a draft, we had mandatory service. That tended to produce a group of citizens who had sacrificed and therefore were willing to contribute to their country. And I think young people would do very well if we had a slightly upgraded system of service in this country. We have it with AmeriCorps and other forms of national service. I'm not calling for a draft again, but something that gets people out of their own skin a little bit and being involved with other people. And it can be volunteer organizations, doesn't have to be the government. So the solutions to what you're talking about, really what we're trying to do is rebuild citizenship in this country, where people are engaged, not just a few, but everybody gets engaged at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. These are tough problems, but our Bipartisan Policy Center report does talk about these as well.
Early in my career, I was one of the 2 or 3 co-sponsors with a Republican congressman of national service legislation. And what it provided was that when people reach a certain age, whether it's 18 or 21, whatever the age is, they had to perform either a year or two of national service to our country, and that if they went in the military, they got greater benefits for college. If they didn't have to go in the military. They could go in some civilian service, but the government didn't offer them as much if they opted for civilian service. It had almost no support in Congress. It went absolutely nowhere. Now, there have been efforts to revive that from time to time. It would be expensive for our government if we required millions and millions of young people to give a year or two for their country. I think it would be a very healthy thing. I'm not sure that we can pass it.
Most of the changes we've seen have come through the initiative and referendum process. They don't come from the politicians that benefit from the current system. I mean, that just makes a lot of sense. So in California, 2 redistricting initiatives were defeated before they finally were able to come through with one. And part of that was because the legislature had become so dysfunctional there. They were paying state employees with script. They couldn't even get the money to them on time. So until the people start reacting to this, I don't think the people who are in office are going to do anything about it.
Yeah, good question. Well, I want to just hawk this book for a moment by Tom Davis, Martin Frost, and Richard Cohen, called The Partisan Divide. I think that these 2 gentlemen will be out upstairs signing books.
In the lobby.
In the lobby. I want to thank everybody. I especially want to thank our current members, Greg Walden and Chris Van Hollen. And thank you all for being here. I think
go on out, I guess.
And then the people are going on out. We want you to go on out and get your book signed, okay?
Thank you, fellas.
Hey, absolutely.
Good discussion. Thank you.